Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Seven Stones podcast. We like to cover a broad range of topics, including business, real estate, legal advice, people of Indonesia, and many more. In this episode, we're going to be diving into what we think the future of Indonesia will look like based on recent events and how they have shaped today's normal. Events such as a global pandemic or the new Omnibus Law are set to change business as usual the way we have perceived it to be before. Business-wise, environmental-wise, and mindset-wise. So what is in store for Indonesia's future? With me today, I have Terry and Andy, co-directors and co-founders of Seven Stones Indonesia, to give you their thoughts on the matter. So before we dive into Indonesia's future, let's just give a little brief on what the general world outlook looks like. We have a bit of a cloudy financial situation, some political issues going around. Maybe anyone wants to give some insight?
Yeah, I guess we all are very aware of the pandemic and everyone's opinion and not on that. So that obviously makes a massive impact, not just on Indonesia, but also the entire world. I guess also the conflict prior to that in between, in particular, China and US, a little bit also in between European Union and Indonesia in some trade-related issues. Is still going on, so it's a difficult situation, not just for Indonesia, but the entire world, I think, right now.
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
But you mentioned in your blog about this that inside Indonesia there's actually been some positive things or actually innovative things happening with some international trade agreements.
Yeah, they've been on the cards for a while though, haven't they? It's not just something that's just happened. I think
I think in blessing in disguise in some ways the COVID pandemic issue has obviously made these issues further important, and the Indonesian government has responded to that to speed up these issues or various issues like the trade agreements and so on. So they've actually ratified a few of them a bit faster than what was the plan, I think, and that's obviously good and helps to reduce the impact.
So just gave it away in the previous question, but what's in store for Indonesia is based on a few blogs you have written. In it, you mention a lot about Indonesia's potential and Indonesia's investment climate. Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
I can. I think, first of all, Indonesia is as we all know, it's a big country. It has a very big population. It's very, very rich in natural resources. And I think one of the sort of biggest question mark over the years has been Indonesia's own will to open up more and regulate their own markets and supporting systems around this. And that is now happening really, really fast as well. Like the main issues for Indonesia over the years has been lack of infrastructure, and we know there's a massive continued development on that. Another concern has been health and education available for the masses of the people, and Indonesia is now opening up more and more to also foreign institutions to come in. Medical, so now they have a pension or a insurance structure set up so that people can actually get proper health and support if they have illness and so on. And also on that side forward, I think Indonesia will open up more and more for foreign hospitals and doctors and support in general. And then the last has obviously been the legal framework of doing business in Indonesia, where the now passed Omnibus Law is making a massive impact. So with these 3-4 main obstacles now being really focused on, Indonesia will probably move forward dramatically on the index of ease of doing business, and this is something the international community sees more and more too. In addition to being easier, it also has a massive potential.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think the length of time that both Terry and myself have been here, we've seen some significant changes from a place that was really kind of almost third worldy it's grown and developed into a real powerhouse. If you ask me, the potential I think is enormous. It's got a very young population, which is significant. It's getting very creative. Well, it's always been a very creative place, but I think with the advent of digital platforms and digital technology, it really lends itself to this young, dynamic, creative Indonesian force. So I'm always positive. I try to write very positively about Indonesia, not because we're being paid by the government or anything like that, but because I genuinely think that there is great potential moving forward here.
So you've also mentioned that business in Indonesia is set to be much easier to do. Is this because of the Omnibus Law, or also because of a new mindset kind of coming in, or?
I think it's driven by this mindset, and it's driven by, almost like waking up from a bad dream, realizing that today could be a fantastic day, and seizing the day and grabbing opportunities and kind of realizing that there is something that we can add to society and humanity and the growth of a country and things. So. Yeah,
I think that's a good point, and I think the starting point is always on the mindset. And Jokowi, when he went on a campaign for his first election, he did state that he was going to revolutionize the mindset of Indonesians, and not that they need to necessarily, wake up or it's just been a very dogmatic mindset, dogmatic structure to how government has been operated and how people behave and not. But that, I think, has triggered this massive impact to the central government and now further down in provincial and regencies, that they want to do the right thing. They want to make the changes. Like we keep talking about Omnibus Law, and I think there was an editor in Jakarta Post who wrote about this and referred to it as the Big Bang. It's a change that in a normal way of implementing laws and changes through the National Assembly would have taken somewhere between 10 and 20 years to execute. So it's mind-blowing, and I don't think I've seen any country being that dramatic in their bureaucracy and changes.
Does it also involve any new rules regarding foreigners owning property? Because I've also seen a lot of, maybe not so recent, but a dramatic increase in investment interest in Indonesia, and foreigners wanting to come here, set up businesses, invest, and all that.
I think there is one, I think it's Article 144 or something in the Omnibus Law that does go a little bit further than what we've seen in the past, that expats now in their own name can own what we call a strata title, or a fractional freehold title in an apartment block, for instance in Jakarta or other places where high-rise buildings is allowed. In the past, that particular law isn't really a massive change, because that's been possible also in the past, but they had a bit of a funny regulation saying it had to be 11th floor and up or something, so you were further away from this fractional piece of land, but now you can actually be on the ground floor and so on. So there's progress there. But also the agrarian ministry is talking about further streamlining the general ownerships. There's talk about allowing foreigners to be able to mortgage, which now is impossible, and possibly also some kind of residential status if you invest into
that'll make a big
property.
difference, won't it, if you can get mortgages?
Massive change, and there's pros and cons in that, and people think it'll drive prices up and so on, and maybe it will in certain areas, but that's just economical sense and growth as a result of that, not necessarily just expats coming in.
So especially with recent times, we've seen a stronger emphasis on the domestic market, with Indonesia having quite a strong one. What is the potential looking like there?
I think if we see back on crisis in the past, financial crisis, natural disaster, there's whatever it is, Indonesia is known to have a very strong, almost impossible to knock over domestic economy. And in times like this, they lean more into their agriculture and domestic economy. So they that way aren't impacted in the same way as other countries that has big international exposures. In that too, there is a potential that Indonesia now, with this ease of doing business and other aspects they do to progress on that, opens up for a much bigger potential foreign market in general, that then will obviously impact the economy and the general growth and create labor and so on and so on.
We've been talking about this for I don't know for how long really, but a long time, about the potential of the domestic market here. If you look at 270 odd million people, there's a lot of opportunities domestically, rather than relying, particularly, let's say for example with tourism. We have lots of discussions with people about tourism, and people tend to think that, particularly in a place like Bali, that Bali relies completely on foreign travellers, particularly from places like Australia. But the numbers would tell you something different. There are almost twice as many domestic travellers who come to Bali than foreign travellers.
And they spend almost as much.
And they tend to stay longer.
Yeah, I've even seen that a lot, where a lot of my younger friends from Jakarta are traveling here because they want to step out of the city and be in a place that's...
especially now, I mean, where I'm staying right now, down in Seminyak, almost every second car is an out of Bali number plate.
Wow.
So you've got Jakarta and Surabaya and Jogja and Lombok, and it's just busy with domestics, which is very encouraging. It's kind of it's almost, I think, similar to what the Chinese have been going through. Really, their economy, for example, hasn't really been impacted as strongly as Western economies over this crisis. Maybe that's because it's focusing on its domestic market. There's a lot of opportunities with domestic businesses here, I think, and it's encouraging to see. It's not again. Maybe I don't think it's everyone's cup of tea when you kind of say that do you really need all of these foreign travellers and foreign business entities coming in? Well, to a degree, yes, but not so that it's so reliant you can't do without them.
Not as much as we think.
Not as much as we tend to think.
Yeah. You've also mentioned that Indonesia, compared to other Southeast nations in the past, and how we maybe seemed a little bit behind. However, now you make a comparison that it's almost a leading nation in that aspect. And Andy, you mentioned earlier that we're kind of becoming this powerhouse.
Yeah.
What does that look like compared to the other Southeast Asian nations?
I think particularly with digital aspects, Indonesia is leading the way in Southeast Asia. There's more transactional value, digital transactional value through the digital economy that happens in Indonesia, way more than any other Southeast Asian nation. We've got startups like Gojek and Traveloka and Tokopedia and Bukalapak, and these are serious players.
I think also in the past, the world has always talked about the Southeast Asian tigers and the potential, and some of the countries moving ahead quicker than others. And it was always said among some of the neighboring countries to Indonesia that Indonesia is sleeping and don't wake it up, because once it does, it'll take over. And that I see happening, on the political agenda, economical, Andy mentioned, tech and so on, but just because of the massive size and the massive population and potential, it's literally taking over, the market being the driving force of this region.
That's kind of a very, as you've mentioned, encouraging thing to hear as well. That we're kind of waking up to our power here in Indonesia.
I think it should be encouraging, and anyone that's listening to this kind of thinking, well, would Indonesia be a safe place to invest, or a good place to invest, or a good place to do this? The answer to all of those is yes, definitely it is, because we're actually watching it happen, and we're living it.
You talk a little bit about how the forming of the Nordic Council Indonesia is a good example of why investors should consider relocating and investing in Indonesia. Can you give some insight on that?
I think one of the motivations for the Nordic Council is because in general the Nordic mindset is very set to fit with what goes on in Indonesia. They invest here for the right reasons. They are not necessarily very politically motivated, and there's a lot of opportunities. Yeah, so I think there's a good fit with Nordic interest into Indonesia. There's a lot of technology, there's a lot of alternative energy, and more than anything, a lot of finance available to support good Indonesian setups and investment projects.
I think particularly on the environmental green topics, actually. We've been to a couple of seminars from Nordic countries presenting alternatives to waste management and water and alternative energy and things, and it's crazy cool stuff. I mean, really.
I think that the general view too that the Nordic countries are relatively small in population and market size, so they have if they want to have growth and they want to expand on the technologies and so on, they need to find large emerging markets like Indonesia and other places in Asia right now. So that I think is one of our main motivations to set up this Nordic Council, to help build that bridge, if that makes sense. There's still cultural differences and mindset differences that doesn't always fit, and that's where we can come in and support both ways, also with Indonesian products that might fit into the the Nordic markets and
that was something we had a meeting yesterday, a Nordic Council meeting yesterday, and that was one of the things that we were discussing, was that it's a two-way street. It's not just Nordic investments coming into Indonesia, but it's also Indonesian opportunities in Nordic countries. So we want to see it work both ways.
Just going off what you mentioned briefly about the environmental side of this, what's in store for Indonesia's future there, and why is that important, especially with all the conflicts and confusions happening regarding the environmental section of the Omnibus Law?
Yeah, that's a good question.
I think there's been a lot of the eco or the green aspect of the Omnibus Law, in addition to the labor laws, is the two aspects that has been highlighted as being possibly a negative aspect. I don't agree to that. I think it's just a matter of how people actually read the regulations. And what they've done is that, for instance, some people will say that the environmental study for buildings and businesses are no longer needed. That's not correct. You still need it, but it comes towards the end, because it's been a obstacle that has held back investments. For instance, in Bali, it can take 6, 7, 8 months before you have this, and that's just too difficult. But if you suddenly, let's say you build a villa or whatever it is, and you haven't complied with this, the fines and the possible reactions then from the government is very strict and very, very harsh. So
from what I understand, it's also connected to your license to do business, right? You could lose that in addition to if you don't comply with the environmental laws.
So I think it's just a matter of understanding that some people have an opinion based on what they read in a paper or hear from someone, and people should actually read the document, even though it's 1,200 pages or something. It's worth looking into.
Speaking about opinions,
we don't have opinions.
Like with anything, mindset is the key. And you mentioned having 2020 foresight. What does that mean by your definitions and opinions?
2020 foresight. What's that? I mean, the whole idea of 2020 hindsight, really, isn't it? It's like, but that's all changed because of what's happened in 2020.
Mm-hmm.
I think
related to your investment roadmaps again, right? Starting at the end and looking back to how you need to.
Yeah,
I think that's one aspect that we had conversations like this yesterday, and we keep having this. One of the main challenges or issues that I see with this. Indonesians obviously have a proud history and had challenges like any country, and then now, like we discussed just before, waking up to their massive potential and taking a massive pride in that. Likewise, I think a lot of expats often have I wouldn't say, a bit of a negative view on the mentality and what kind of country Indonesia is and so on. And then they come in with a mindset from a Western culture and a legal structure that they start being judgmental, while Indonesia's legal system is actually reflecting their own culture, and it should by all means do so. So that again, I think, is also back to the mindset that Indonesia isn't for everyone. You need to adjust and be on the terms of the country that you're in, like in other countries. Having said that, every country now is internationalizing more and more, and streamlining their regulations. But there's still a big aspect to that in Indonesia that you got to come in, and then you'll have a massively pleasant experience. And if you don't, then like anywhere, it's painful and it's difficult to fit in.
In all of this, after recent events with the pandemic and the Omnibus Law, where do you think Bali specifically is headed? What will tourism look like? Do you think we need to change the way things are done? And what diversification do you think Bali should invest in so as not to be too dependent on mass tourism?
Gosh.
Yeah,
where do we start with that? I mean, really.
Good morning.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. That's I think a lot of people think that tourism has changed forever because of this pandemic, and some people think not. I'm not sure, and I guess at some stage we'll see what happens with that. I do think, though, that it actually creates an opportunity in the middle of the sad situation that we see now, where Bali can consolidate itself a little bit. It can take a deep breath and sort of look back at, Andy was mentioning before, the Australian market, the Chinese market, and there's good parts and less good parts in all markets, and sort of decide what it wants to be all about. And I think one change we'll see is that Indonesia will become more and more a residential place, or a semi-residential place for not just foreigners but also people from Jakarta and Surabaya and so on, because it has a good lifestyle, it has a good feel, it's relaxed, it's a multi-international community. I think we'll see a change to the average stay. Like prior to COVID, it was 3-4 days. People came in from Singapore, Japan, China, and all these big markets, and that I think will change. I also see now that the expat community, the Balinese community, comes together in a different way, because there's not that many left of, in particular, the expats. So it's easier to have a conversation on what we want to see into the future, and possibly with that being capable of making good impact. Bali is also an agenda to sort of try to diversify into other income streams, like a little bit of, I wouldn't call it industry, but possibly medical aspects, medical productions, tech industries, electric motorbikes, and so on, which I think is smart. Back to the tourism too, I think that domestic market makes a much better direct impact to the domestic economy than, for instance, huge numbers of Australians or Chinese and so on. It isn't necessarily a positive impact when you start looking at the bearing capacity, infrastructure breakdown, water, all these issues that we know are there.
I think there are three ways that Bali could make a significant shift in its approach to tourism and the revenue streams that generates. One is health, one is education, and the other is tech. There's been talk around for the idea of Bali becoming like an Indonesian version of Silicon Valley and that sort of. There's been talk of that for quite some time, but you see more and more young kids here that are really into the idea of tech and learning about tech and kind of experimenting with it, and that's very encouraging. And I think there's great opportunities for businesses to expand on that. Education, I think this would be a super place to set up universities and franchise universities with great campuses, and again that feeds the idea of tech and that kind of industry,
especially with young people around as well.
Yeah, I mean, really, it's, you know, Bandung's a good example for that. Bandung's a university town, and what's one of the things that Bandung's famous for is its tech, you know, which I think is encouraging. And the other thing really is medical tourism or medical infrastructures. So health is a good one. Again, that kind of ties back to the idea of education and could easily tie into the idea of tech. So I think if the government here focused on those three aspects, instead of like Terry's saying, instead of relying on, you know, a couple of hundred foreign visitors that tend to spend a lot of money in bars and buying bintang t-shirts and that sort of stuff, instead of looking at those, maybe look at a better quality of visitor that spends more money, that spends more time. But again, around the idea of medical tourism, for example, I know I was writing about government plans to improve the medical infrastructure here to take advantage of medical tourism. It's a great place to rehabilitate after an operation. It's a great place to be pampered when you're recovering from a sickness. You know, it's great.
I think one aspect too that we see now and the sort of worldwide trend, work from home. You know, a lot of people have been told to work from home, and then they discover that, you know, living in downtown New York or UK or London, you know, some of these places you have a tiny little apartment, the weather isn't the best, and the living cost is just very, very high. Well, you can come down here and have a much better quality of life. Weather is nice, climate is nice, international communities, and you get so much more for your money. So there's a lot of individuals, but also, again, tech companies and other businesses that look at relocating. And then we see this in all the communications that we have with different business communities and you know, communities abroad. There's a massive build-up for that potential. So I think once things ease up and it's easier to travel again, now you can actually come into Indonesia anytime prior to getting a visa and capable of finding a flight. But that momentum, I think, will just build up further and further and further.
There was one, we had a couple of weeks ago a Nordic gathering. One of the speakers at the gathering was talking about the movie industry, and it was really interesting what he was talking about. You know, and I didn't know, I've been here for quite some time, and I didn't realise that there was a studio up near Gianyar somewhere, near Ubud. I didn't realise there was a movie studio here. You know, and he's really upbeat and very positive about the future because, you know, because of the costs involved, because of the talent that's locally available here, because of the backdrops and the scenery and all that sort of stuff. Bali's got a great future.
Yeah, and going off on both of those points, I was in a webinar recently where they mentioned we don't really need to change the dependency on mass tourism. We just need to change the way we receive tourists, how there needs to be more quality tourism. And as an example, Balinese should open up their homes for little boutique homestays instead of creating these massive hotels. And also this whole mindset of, you see someone making these really interesting artwork and then you copy it and create it too, and suddenly everyone in that whole area is selling the same thing. That also needs to change because then the prices drop and we go into this whole cycle again, which you both just kind of talked about before. But moving on another blog, you've also mentioned, we're going a little bit into the technicalities now, the government's plans to incorporate industrial development zones. What is this about, and will it impact or develop the economy in any way?
I think the wording to that, again, some foreigners and sometimes also locals pick up on the industrial zone, and it's not going to be like you're going to have huge factories and so on. It's like Andy said, it's focused on a few very specific soft industry, if that makes sense. These zones are now currently being proposed to the central government, and they will be up in Tabanan and Jembrana, where there's a lot of land available. Will that impact the economy? I think it will, but I think it's a very long-term strategy, which is good. You need long-term plans because you need to obviously build these areas, develop these areas. You need infrastructure, you need roads, you need maybe more airports, harbors, and so on. And that's something that needs time. So we're probably looking at an impact out of this coming in the next 5 to 10 years. Then you also have the challenge with skilled labor, for some of these industries today. That's a challenge, and that is something that fits with what Andy talked about before too, the educational aspect, to actually be able to create that knowledge and that potential in the labor market.
I think one of the motivators behind suggesting that, the idea of special zones to do specific kinds of businesses and industries, is to spread the wealth a little bit. A lot of the money that's generated by tourism here tends to stay in one particular part of Bali, and that's Badung. And other parts of Bali don't get that access to those money streams, So I think one of the ideas behind it is to set these areas up in areas that don't usually get a lot of tourists, don't usually generate their own money, to be able to kind of literally spread the wealth.
And while we're on the topic of zones, you also mentioned special economic zones. What is that about?
Well, Indonesia has a concept, they call it special economical zones or kawasan ekonomi khusus in Indonesia. And this is a concept that I think was started way back with probably SPY, but it didn't take off, and now is another driving force within the Jokowi administration. So what it does, and it's more aimed towards areas that hasn't seen good development. So they literally create a zone, a couple of thousand hectares to be a factory area, to be a tourism area. Like for instance, Mandalika is a special economical zone in Lombok. You have a few in Java now for industrial zones and so on. So what it does is it just ease up on the red tape. It just cuts straight through because it's a special economical zone. Don't need to deal with all the different levels of bureaucracy in the regency, province, and central government. It also has a very clear structure on tax holiday and tax benefits, in particular for larger investments. So that's something that Bali is exploring on this part. The challenge, I think, is going to be in the regulation and application for those special economical zone, whether it fits saying that Bali needs that development to diversify off from the dependency on tourism.
Other than that, does anyone have any other comments or insights about our bright future ahead for Bali and beyond?
I think you touched on it a little bit when you talked about the local sort of homestays, pondok wisata, so on. I think the villas, the homestays, the boutique concepts, all of those aspects, I think will be fine as long as they can define really what they offer in terms of quality and products and so on around this. Where that part of the market, the what do we call it, the residential part of the market will be fine, and it'll come back quicker than maybe we think. The big question mark and where the dialogue and conversations need to be held is on the mass tourism, and in the big hotels, they need maybe 30%, 40% just to break even. That's going to be difficult. And what markets are they going to go after? So the concern there is that they'll go straight back into some kind of price war and aim at flying in millions of Chinese or cheap, I don't know, no criticism or anything towards any particular market, because every market has quality market and sort of low-end market, but the Australian, Indian markets and so on. So that remains to be seen. And I think will be a challenge for the government to have any resistance to that, because the owners of these hotels too, they will have a demand and a drive and possibly a political support to push this through and get straight back into it. But we'll see.
Something that we were writing about last year was the idea of quality versus quantity for tourism, and one of the things I'd like to see for sure is not price wars, where it's the cheapest thing that you can buy kind of thing. And I think that's what the reputation that Bali has in some certain markets, that it's a really cheap place to come to for holiday. Not that that's necessarily a bad thing, but I think the perception isn't particularly positive when it's like that. So instead of having price wars, we could have quality wars. You know, so people are competing against each other for tourism segments, competing against each other for providing better services, providing more memorable experiences. That would be nice to see.
So going into the future, it's also about what you have in your quality and what you're offering, and not just how you package it.
Yeah,
right?
Absolutely. And the perception that brings too. We've been doing some sort of internal training sessions this last week or so, and one of them has been about value propositions and the idea of creating memorable experiences, and the whole idea of the way we deal with customers. It's not focused around the money, it's focused around the experience. And if you provide a good experience, and as an island, Bali could do this, it could provide a better experience on many different levels, and I think that would in itself attract more money, rather than just being focused and just almost like blinkered to let's make some money. And I think if you blinkered on that, you lose the experience side, you lose the personal side. And I think Bali's a wonderful, in fact most of Indonesia that I've been to is wonderful for that. It's so warm and welcoming, and hospitality is almost a natural state of being for a lot of people here. You know,
especially with this place, kind of a lot of people get touched when they come here.
Sure.
Right? So tapping into that would only be good for the future.
Absolutely.
I think like sort of last couple of words with Indonesia and sort of how the job market today is very challenging for young people. Like my dad had one job his entire life. You know, he started off as a sailor when he was 15 and he retired as a sailor. I don't know, maybe he hasn't really retired, but he stick to that profession his entire life. I probably never had a job, but you know, have had a few different ventures and aspects I've been working with. And then the next generation, like people like yourself and others, you can look at it, you have probably 3 or 4 different jobs at the same time, you know. And that I think is one of the main challenges, but also one of the most encouraging aspects of the Omnibus Law for me, that when I read this, it's about entrepreneurship, it's about enhancing individuals, not just expat, that's just a small part of it, but to get Indonesians into understanding that if you want to thrive in the future business community and markets, like Andy says, it has a lot to do with values and mindset and so on, but to get that into your structure, set yourself up and have an entrepreneurship driven mind. If not, you will struggle.
That's actually something that I'm reading into a lot too. The whole idea of entrepreneurship here is really being driven, you know. And again, I think a lot of it's sort of because of digital technology. It's much easier for somebody with a device or an iPad or something like that to sort of make a website, set up a little business, do some trading, whatever it is. But I think there's a big drive in that direction.
Lots of great and positive news then for
Always.
Indonesia's future. So thank you so much for joining us today, Terry and Andy.
You're welcome.
And for all you listeners out there, if you're still confused or want to ask more, you can reach these people through our website, www.sevenstonesindonesia.com, or directly send us an email at hello@sevenstonesindonesia.com. You can also reach us through these links if you have any other inquiries regarding real estate, tourism, legal advice, business, and marketing. If that's not for you, we're also available to answer your questions through Instagram and LinkedIn. Thank you so much for tuning in on this episode of Partners in Growth. Let us know what kinds of conversations you'd like to listen to on the Seven Stones podcast, and we look forward to seeing you in our next episode.